Thank you so much for joining me. The guest on this episode is Dr. Anthony Siracusa, and we are discussing his book, Nonviolence Before King, The Politics of Being and the Black Freedom Struggle, from the University of North Carolina Press. In the early 1960s, thousands of black activists used nonviolent direct action to challenge segregation at lunch counters, movie theaters, skating rinks, public pools, and churches across the United States, battling for and winning social change. Organizers against segregation had used litigation and protests for decades, but not until the advent of nonviolence did they succeed in transforming ingrained patterns of white supremacy on a massive scale. In his book, Anthony Siracusa unearths the deeper lineage of anti-war pacifist activists and thinkers from the early 20th century who developed nonviolence into a revolutionary force for black liberation. We packed a lot in for this short episode, and I really hope you enjoy the conversation. If you enjoy the conversation, please check out the book Nonviolence Before King. So please welcome Dr. Anthony Siracusa. A book. You have a book called Nonviolence Before King, The Politics of Being and the Black Freedom Struggle. So congratulations on the release of that book. Do you want to just tell a little bit about what your work is about, so that the listeners out there can understand kind of like what you do on a professional level?
For sure. Yeah. And by the way, I sent this book to Chris Hanna from Propaganda. And then when you all interviewed him, he actually mentioned the book.
Yeah, he did.
He was talking to y'all. So, because we corresponded a little bit through his Patreon page. But long story short, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and that was the place where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968. And being a young guy, of course, we all have to be from somewhere, right? So I grew up in Memphis, and like many people, I was like, oh, I can't wait to leave Memphis. But
bingo. Yeah, me in St. Louis, I wanted to leave. The whole time I was there, I wanted to go.
Right. And then as I got older, though, I started to realize, wow, Memphis is kind of a unique place. And it was a number of factors. And the first one was being 10, 11 years old, like all school children. I got in a big yellow school bus. They took me to the National Civil Rights Museum in downtown Memphis. This is the place where Dr. King was assassinated. It's at the Lorraine Motel. It's been turned into a museum. And I remember going in there and they had a full-sized Ku Klux Klansman's robe inside of a giant glass case. I'm an 11-year-old kid, right? Seeing this object. And first of all, it's just scary because it's on a mannequin. It's got a mask. It just looks scary. But I also knew there's something powerful about this object. I don't know what it is or why it's so powerful. But then I walked around the corner and they had the full-size Greyhound bus that Freedom Riders used to test segregation laws across the U.S. South. This was blown up by the Klan in Anniston, Alabama during the Freedom Rides in 1961. So again, I'm like 11 years old. I'm seeing these objects of immense violence, and I don't understand them. Well, fast forward, I started college, a little place in Memphis called Rhodes College. I went back to that Civil Rights Museum on a guided tour with a person who became my faculty mentor, Dr. Charles W. McKinney Jr. And he explained everything in exquisite detail. And basically, Greg, what I decided was I wanted to study African-American history because I wanted to learn more about myself by way of learning about the place where I came from and the world historical forces that shaped that place, Memphis. So I did that for my undergrad, went to Vanderbilt University, and my dissertation was really the foundation for the book. And I'll just give you the thumbnail spiel about that. But essentially, when we think about nonviolence and the Black freedom movement, often the first person that comes to mind, Martin Luther King Jr., right? He was this great herald, this sage of nonviolence. But as King himself mentioned in the late 1950s, he went on a pilgrimage to nonviolence. So you got to remember when he first started in the Montgomery bus boycott, right? Leading this epic campaign that began the transformation of our nation, he had guns all over his house. He had bodyguards, right? In fact, Glenn Smiley, one of the white pacifists who came down to Montgomery to support the movement, he said, I couldn't find a place to sit because there were so many guns in King's house. So King was not just this person who came out of the womb committed to nonviolence. And by the way, it raises a whole bunch of larger questions, right? Because Black people in this country, like Indigenous people in Canada and other places, were actively persecuted, right? Lynching was a common form of political violence in this country from the end of the Civil War up through the middle of the 20th century. Over 4,500 African Americans lynched in cold blood. So then the question becomes, well, are Black people naturally inclined towards nonviolence? And the answer is no. When you look
Mm.
back at the Black political tradition, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, right? They're all talking about self-defense, talking about using guns, right? What did Ida B. Wells say? The Winchester rifle deserves a place of prominence in everyone's home. So,
Mm.
Greg, this just became a huge question for me. So I'm like, well, why, how, and why did nonviolence become this massive force for African American folks fighting for freedom? And
Yeah.
basically, the book answers that question. And
Yeah.
so I explain that right over the course of 5 chapters. And the long and short of it is, it was a collaboration between white pacifists and Black religious intellectuals. And there's a key figure, and I'd encourage anyone listening to the pod to go check out a man named Howard Thurman. And he really became the intellectual architect of the ideas that became the inspiration for the political tactics of nonviolent direct action. So when you read about all these ministers running around like King, like his lieutenant, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, like James M. Lawson Jr., who has a whole chapter in the book, he's on the cover of the book. All of these guys got their ideas from Howard Thurman. So I kind of tell the story of the way ideas got connected to political tactics, and then the ways in which that became a force that revolutionized the social, political, and cultural life of the United States.
Amazing. Yeah. And I'm looking at this, the index right now. And so I love the topics that are presented here. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the race and the problem of pacifism
Yeah.
chapter. Like, tell me a little bit about this, because this really jumps out at me, because whenever we think about the racial history of the United States, which goes to, go all the way back to the settler colonialist approaches of, taking over the entire continent. It goes all the way back. What is the problem with, pacifist reactions whenever we're talking about issues of race in the continental United States and Canada as well?
For sure. Yeah. And there's a big reason that I start the book with this, because this is the crux of the issue. So, long story short, when the First World War broke out in 1914, 1915, you had a number of white folks, a lot of them Quakers, but not all Quakers, many of them Protestant religious people who lived in England at the time. And they said, we're not going to go along with this war. This is a senseless war. It goes against God's will for creation. And we're just not going to cooperate, right? We're not going to fight this war. That pacifist ideology in that moment, because it's hard. I mean, as a teacher, to put yourself back into the shoes of people in 1914, 1915. The First World War was literally a world war, right, in terms of the West. And so to put yourself back in those shoes, right, for people to say, we're not going to fight this war, it just started to spread, and it came into the United States. And you basically had a lot of white religious people. And what they said, Greg, was, because Jesus said, lay the sword aside, right? If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Because Jesus practiced nonviolence, we cannot, in good conscience as Christian people, we cannot fight in the war. Now, here's the problem with pacifism. What's going on in the United States in 1914? Well, you're getting close to a period called the Red Summer of 1919, right? Where you have widespread violence, right? The Tulsa massacre that happens in the early 20th century has gotten a lot more airplay recently. It kicks off that show, The Watchmen on HBO, if you've seen that, right?
Yeah.
There's massive, rampant, consistent, patterned, predictable violence being doled out against Black people. So if you're an African-American person in 1915, and you've got white people looking at you and saying, hey, you really need to not use violence, that becomes an unethical position. And so this is where Howard Thurman enters. And he says, it is not ethical for a white person to tell a Black person, don't use violence. When I've got white people shooting up my house, I got white people trying to lynch me for registering to vote. But what Howard Thurman says is this. He says there's something that is genius at the heart of pacifism, and that is the will to love everyone. And he says, but we've got to turn this into a creative, nonviolent force. So he says, these white people telling us we should be nonviolent, that's not going to do it. But how can we, as African-American folks, look at our religious traditions, our roots here in this country, our cultural traditions, and build something that could be powerful enough to transform the conditions of our lives, defined by Jim Crow violence, lynching, and segregation? So that begins that process. I like what's at the heart of pacifism. I don't like the unethical racial components of that. And so that's really where African-American folk, particularly Howard Thurman and others, start to say, we are going to create an active nonviolent force. And of course, they look over to Gandhi as an example. But one of the things that I point out, right, is that here in the United States, there are domestic organizing and political traditions that they draw on, that they feed from. And that includes the labor movement, right? That includes thinking about the women's rights movement. There's a whole legacy in this country going back to the settler colonialism days of nonviolent civil disobedience. So how do they draw on those traditions and pull it all together and turn it into this force of nonviolence? That's what the book is really about, but it starts with that central problem, race, and the problem of pacifism.
Absolutely amazing. There's a lot of other figures listed too in the book that maybe not everybody knows some of these names. Like you talk about James M. Lawson Jr. You talk about Pauli Murray. Some of these names are brand new to me whenever I review your work. And I'm a person who has read things. I'm not completely ignorant to a lot of the topics that you discuss in the book, but some of these are brand new to me. What are there any other overlooked figures that you feel like people should be, paying more attention to as far as like the legacy of the civil rights movement and the history of racism in the United States that you found in your research?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I'll talk just briefly about these three figures that you mentioned. And I'll start with Bayard Rustin. If you don't know who Bayard Rustin is, you do know his work because you are familiar with the March on Washington. Bayard Rustin was the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. But there was also a 1941 March on Washington, organized by a man named A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the largest and first Black union in the United States. So Bayard Rustin, he was the most important organizer for Black freedom in the 20th century. Full stop. He was also a gay man. And part of the reason that we don't know as much about Rustin today is because not only was he marginalized during his time period, meaning literally Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, he said, King, I'm not going to work with you, Martin Luther King, if you've got this guy Bayard Rustin running around here, right? And King, unfortunately, succumbed to that and said, Bayard, I got to keep you on the outside. But guess what? King's first book, Stride Towards Freedom, that he wrote after the Montgomery bus boycott, Bayard Rustin wrote that book. Bayard Rustin's fingerprints are all over the movement, but we can't acknowledge the ways in which he contributed in our popular minds because he was marginalized then and continues to be marginalized now. So that was one of the most fun parts. Oh, and I got to tell you this story. So when Bayard passed away, he was life partners with a man named Walter Nagel. And when the book came out, I got an email from Walter Nagel, and he said, I've just read your amazing book about Bayard, and I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate it. And it's one of those things you do. That's why you do this work, right? In some ways. And so Bayard Rustin, and I'll just a teaser here. He goes to jail for 2.5 years for resisting the Second World War, the good war, the war to end fascism. He says, I'm not fighting in this war because he's a pacifist. And when he gets into jail, it's a segregated jail facility, of course. So what's the first thing he does? He organizes a desegregation campaign. Uses nonviolent civil disobedience in federal penitentiaries to try to desegregate the jails. He was that kind of good troublemaker, to quote the late, great John Lewis. So Bayard Rustin, look him up. There's a great biography about him by John D'Amelio, who's a gay historian, a historian of the gay experience. And it's called Lost Prophet. And it is so compelling. I encourage everyone to just pick that book up, listen to it on Audible, whatever you want to do. The other figure I want to talk about is Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray was trained as a lawyer in the mid-1940s. She was a phenomenal thinker, went to Howard University, grew up in North Carolina, and she started the first freedom ride before any of the other organized freedom rides, right? We think about 1961. In 1941, she and her friend, Mac, and I say friend because it was probably her lover. As it turned out, Pauli Murray was a lesbian. We would have actually used categories now to think about her as non-binary in terms of gender. Those categories weren't available to her then, but she and her friend Mac, they were asked to move to the segregated portion of a bus in 1941. They refused to do so. They got put into a jail cell in Virginia, and it became this huge hubbub. And the NAACP had been looking for a case, like, how can we test these segregation laws? Well, Pauli Murray, she creates this case, perfect opportunity, but the NAACP declines to pick it up because Pauli Murray was dressed as a boy when she was on the bus. And they thought, this isn't going to be good for the image of the movement. So I write about Pauli and her life, and she becomes a key architect for nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns. She leads one in Washington, D.C. in the mid 1940s, and they desegregate lunch counters and drugstores in Washington, D.C., and they do it all through student power. She organizes students at Howard to do that. Incredibly important figure. Last thing I'll say about her legal legacy, her arguments that she developed in law school, those became the foundation for the legal challenge to end segregation in the United States, known as Brown v. Board of Education. So again, a critical figure. Her fingerprints are everywhere, but she was marginalized in her lifetime, marginalized today. Last thing I'll say is about James M. Lawson Jr. He is still alive, 93 years old. He organized the Nashville sit-in campaigns in early 1960. And often we think now about wave after wave of protesters sitting down on lunch counter stools, being arrested or beaten up, and then another wave comes in, sits down, takes their places. James M. Lawson patented that technique for overwhelming the system. And he did it in Nashville, and he did it by drawing on the traditions I've been talking about: Howard Thurman, Bayard Rustin, Pauli Murray. He stood on their shoulders. He drew on their ideas. And it was really, I argue in the book, that Nashville movement that became the tipping point, right, between a nation that was committed to segregation and racial violence and one that said, we're going to transform these conditions.
Wow, amazing. And there's so much in there about the story of how people were told to comply with certain directives and what types of resistance were made available to them, and how they processed in real time and those strategies of what it means to resist unjust actions and or comply with the ways that society was expecting them to go with. Amazing. Yes. Thank you so much for that overview of the book.
Yes.